In their cosmology, in their belief systems, they believed that nature connected back to the divine. Everything around them was considered part of the divine world.
Thank you for joining me on the Unrefined Podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Spain, along with Lindsy Waters, where each week we delve into the mysteries that shape our world, from the tangible to the supernatural, with the foundation rooted in biblical truth. For more content and exclusive resources, visit us at unrefinedpodcast.com. Now, let's dive into this week's episode. Hey, you guys. In this episode, we are jumping into the mysteries of one of the world's oldest and most mysterious sites, Gobekli Tepe. Joining us is a researcher who has spent many years uncovering secrets buried deep in ancient history. He brings a wealth of knowledge in biblical archaeology, ancient civilizations, and the supernatural, promising to shed light on the hidden meanings and spiritual implications of this mysterious temple. We welcome the author of Decoding Gobekli Tepe, Dr. Aaron Judkins, and also his co-author, Dr. Judd, who is not here today, but I want to mention he's a co-author as well. Hey, Aaron, is it right I call you Aaron, or should I call you Dr. Aaron?
No, Aaron's fine.
Okay, all right, cool. But thank you so much for coming on our show. It's been a long time coming, but we're so excited and glad to have you here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, to get this started, to kind of just to dive right in, I'm going to start with just a basic question, a little bit about you. So what got you into Gobekli Tepe? What sparked your interest? Why Gobekli Tepe, I guess, would be a good question.
Back in 2012, I just wrote a new book called Alien Agenda, The Return of the Nephilim, which debuted.
Good book.
In the book, I had made a reference to Gobekli Tepe. I heard about it a couple of years before that, but I didn't really understand the site. I was intrigued with the two central pillars in Enclosure D that are 18 and a half foot tall. But it wasn't until later on that a guy who follows my work, his name's Roger, he lives in Canada, and Roger hit me up one day and he said, have you looked into Gobekli Tepe? I said, well, I've heard about it, but I haven't really looked into it. And he said, would you, look into this site? And I said, I just really don't have time to look into this and dive into it. And then, I don't know, maybe months later went by and he hit me up a second time. And after the third time, he said, Aaron, you really got to take a look at this. He had some ideas about what it was. I had some ideas what I thought it was. But when I really sat down to take a look at it, everything that I thought I knew about it was amazingly different. And it was different in that I had just made some assumptions about it without really digging into it. And it really blew me away. Things that were not supposed to be considered, in that period of time, which is the Stone Age, is present at the site, which is the megalithic architecture, and that is not supposed to be there. And so I really began to deep dive into this site, and my assumptions that I had thought about what the site was completely shattered, and I realized that Gobekli Tepe really turns the archaeological record upside down, and for those reasons, it began an over 5-year journey for me.
All right, you just opened wide the door for us to just dive right in. So first and foremost, what would be the basic assumptions that you were talking about that you had before, which I would also assume that majority of archaeologists and scientists have probably still to this day? Can you lay a foundation for the basis of what those assumptions are?
Well, mine were different from others.
Okay.
So my assumptions about the site was because it was in the relative proximity and region to Mount Ararat, that this was probably some kind of commemorative site to Noah's Ark with the animals carved on the stones. I assume that it was probably just a commemorative site to Noah and in that event. So that was My basic assumption about it, that's not held by most traditional archaeologists, so they would probably have their own views. As a matter of fact, in the 1960s, it was accidentally surveyed as a Byzantine cemetery, and
Really?
and then quickly dismissed. And it
Mm.
wasn't until the um, the I don't know mid 90s where Dr. Klaus Schmidt from the German Institute of Archaeology was wrapped up a dig in that region. He was asked to go take another look at it, and he immediately recognized it as a an important site going back to the Neolithic.
Hey, Aaron, I don't know if this is getting us off track or what.
No, let's go.
Before I forget, if I read correctly, people can get kind of the chicken and the egg, so to speak, backwards when it comes to agriculture in ancient societies. And it's I want to say your opinion that maybe agriculture came after this society. Could you go into that, the importance of agriculture and when it happened and why it happened relative to Gobekli Tepe?
Well, in the traditional view, people lived this hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Then um, the advent of agriculture, that new way to sow these wild grains that they were harvesting. Those were that was the catalyst for the agriculture. Those wild grains were in that area. There was eichhorn wheat and einhorn wheat, and then barley. But the grains were so tiny that just any little movement, just even with the shift of the wind, those grains would sift out very easily. And with agriculture, they took those seeds and replanted, and every time they would replant, it would cause the hull of the plant to become stronger, and the seeds became bigger, and it became more stable in the hull. So it was this produced more of a reliable crop. And after you replanted over and over and over, this really started the advent of agriculture. And then so because of that, you would have a stable food crop, and then communities formed. And then as a result of all that, then you would have religion that formed because of these communities. But that's not exactly what we see at Gobekli Tepe.
Yeah, it kind
What
of turned
what
it on its head. Yeah.
yeah, what we see at Gobekli Tepe is just the opposite. We see this megalithic site which hosted ritualistic feastings. They were on the highest point of the Jurmis mountain range there, overlooking the plain of Haran. And down along this area, which is known as the Fertile Crescent, were these wild grains of wheat and barley. And so there was ample supply of food in this Haran plain. And not only were the grains readily available, but the animals were quite prolific in this area. Wild gazelles and auric bulls and wild boar and things like this. We found evidence of these things at the site and in the area. We're talking about sickle blades where they would go out to harvest the grains and bring them back. We found animal bones. We found stone tools that have been used for pestles and mortars and things to grind the wheat. Thousands of those. And then shallow limestone vessel plates, things like that. Matter of fact, they found a big stone vault where they were fermenting the barley, and probably into some kind of a mild form of beer. But
Mm.
this area is definitely an area that precedes agriculture. You have this readily abundant food source. They didn't need to plant any of these crops. Again, they would just go down to the Haran plain to harvest these and bring them back. But Gobekli Tepe is a site that where all this is before the advent of agriculture, but yet we have some major issues. We have this monumental stonework that's megalithic architecture in the Stone Age, and which also shows a division of labor and organization. Then we also have people getting together to live at a site before agriculture. But what's more important at Gobekli
Mhm.
Tepe is that it is religious ideology that brought them to the site first. And that religious ideology is evident in the stonework and structures at Gobekli Tepe.
Well, let me ask you this: just you're talking about the religiousness of it. Does that have anything to do with why it was deliberately buried? Can you go into that, the detail of why they intentionally buried it, and how does that challenge the theories of the site's purpose and why it was constructed?
Well, we don't know that it was intentionally buried. There's a
Okay.
theory that it
Yeah.
was.
Okay.
And here's what I'm proposing is
Right.
that there is some evidence of burial. Initially, they thought the entire complex was buried by
Right.
hand intentionally. That's hard to do with a 20-acre site.
Yeah.
I don't see that happening.
Primitive tools too. Yeah.
I think what's happened here is that there's two plausible and reasonable explanations. The reason they thought it was buried is because there's a lot of overburden in the site, but there's no stratigraphy in the site, which is why they think it was buried. Some of the artifacts, like the stone heads, some of the larger stone heads, were intentionally either defaced and put upside down at the bottom of the enclosure near the pillars, and then the site was they were buried in that position. This is also true at Karahan Tepe, where some of the larger stone heads were intentionally defaced, mostly with their noses cut off, and then placed upside down and then buried. We know Karahan Tepe, those stones were intentionally buried.
Hmm.
So I think what's happened at this site at Gobekli Tepe is that because of the larger stone faces were intentionally placed upside down and buried, I think that part was deliberate and intentional. This was probably after the occupational use of Gobekli Tepe,
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps later on, we're not sure. But over
Mm-hmm.
time, the overburden from the site above, because these are enclosures were dug down into the hill, which means they were lower, and there's overburden from the hill above. And I think over time that overburden eventually collapsed into these enclosures and then naturally filled them up. So
Makes
we
sense.
have a two-part answer of yes, part of it was deliberate in some smaller sense, but in the greater sense, I think it was just natural processes and time that filled the rest of the enclosures in.
So this is something that really fascinates me. Let's talk about the astronomical aspects of it, the alignments, and how that could possibly link to, of course, the supernatural, the watchers.
Well, in regards to the orientation of the enclosures, I don't get into that in the book regarding alignments. The overall site itself and how the religious iconography at the site
Hmm.
basically is the symbols and the motifs and the animals has religious ideology connotations. This is directly ties back to their cosmology, and so what I wanted to do was take a look at this more specifically because most archaeologists considered it just simply art motifs on the stones. If you look at the animals in particularly, these animals, there's serpents, there's vultures, there's lions, scorpions, there's bulls, and there's other creatures, but most of them represent Holocene type animals. They're bearing their teeth, they're things that can hurt you, bite you, sting you, or kill you possibly.
Hmm.
None of these animals are reminiscent of animals coming off of Noah's Ark, and this is
Interesting.
one of the reasons why I dismissed my initial theory without really, just a cursory look at it, that I quickly dismissed that. I guess the other viewpoint was to look, well, going back to the stones, actually,
Yeah.
the the
Yeah.
animals, the animals are guardian type. Again, this is why they're reminiscent in these different types of poses, but these animals represent guardian spirits. So they're guarding particular enclosures throughout Gobekli Tepe. So they're the spirits of these animals that are guarding these enclosures or sacred spaces for a particular reason. Symbols on the stones that I get into in the book, but we make a connection between the symbology and the iconography at Gobekli Tepe with religious ideology that points back to the very beginnings of religious worship Again, they date this back to the Neolithic Stone Age. But look, wherever you put this, it's the very beginnings of religious ideology that we have seen in the Neolithic.
Yeah, we could probably go here, just comparative mythology. What really struck me when you were talking about that the architecture is just the animals themselves. They have a similitude to the Bible's aspect of the bull, the of Elohim in the Bible, I guess, so to speak, or watchers in the Bible, right? Is that correct?
Well,
You draw,
not to Elohim. Well, that would be a broad definition.
yeah.
More
Sorry,
specifically to link to the Watchers, and this is where Dr. Burton gets into the book in his chapter in the book.
right?
But look, there's the cherubim that are referenced in the Bible. The cherubim are pretty interesting creatures. These cherubim are listed in Ezekiel,
Yeah.
and it says that every one of these cherubim had 4 faces and 4 wings. The first face was the face of a lion, you have the face of a man, you have the face of a bull, and you have a face of an eagle. But when you start looking at these faces from Ezekiel 1 moving forward to Ezekiel 10, those 4 faces, one particular face changes, and there's one that's particularly absent. It goes from the face of a man to the face of a lion to the face of an eagle, but the face of the bull or the ox is absent, and in its place is the face of the cherub. Which is interesting because the face of the ox is what we see on the Western Pillar 31 at Gobekli Tepe, one of the 18.5-foot tall anthropomorphic pillars that has an image of a bull cranium about where its neck would be. So these are faceless stone anthropomorphic human-like structures. But on the neck of Western Pillar 31 is the image of a bull cranium, which is a bull in profile with its horns. Now that's interesting because this isn't a simple art design. This is telling us some a detailed information that they've carved on this stone for a reason. So I look at all these connections, and then Dr. Burton gets into the Watchers connection. But
Yeah.
this is exactly one of the connections we're seeing at Gobekli Tepe.
Are there any earlier writing or symbols at Gobekli Tepe that might, kind of connect to later biblical texts or anything?
Any particular writings?
Yeah, or communication, I guess would be a better word, to later biblical stuff.
Symbols.
Yeah, symbols, stuff like that. Yeah,
Well, one of the symbols goes back to the one I just pointed out, which is
right.
the image of the ox on Western Pillar 31. Now, regarding writings, again, this is conventionally dated to Stone Age, which is Neolithic, pre-pottery Neolithic A, which is before the invention of pottery and the invention of writing. So they put this way back to about 10,000 years ago or so. I think some of the symbology and the iconography on the stones is a language. And the reason I say that is because on some of the other pillars and the adjacent enclosures is a prominent Luwian logogram symbol for Deus, which is transliterated into Latin, which means, or from Latin, Deus, which means God.
God, yeah.
This is very prominent logogram that we see on the stone at Gobekli Tepe. And that really jumped out to me because this is a logogram for Luwian. Now, Luwians were contemporaneous with the Hittites, and the Hittites actually they had their own language, but they adopted part of the Luwian language into their culture. And Luwian was basically a spoken language, but in the writing portion, they wrote in logograms. What's a logogram? Logogram is one symbol represents a word. And so they used this type of writing specifically for formal monumental writing on stone. And this is exactly what we see on the stones at Gobekli Tepe, a formal monumental writing on stone with logograms. And one of these logograms, a lot of the Luwian language has not been deciphered. There's hundreds and hundreds of symbols that we do not have a context for their understanding yet. But there are many of the symbols that have been deciphered. And Deus is one of them. Another one is kind of an English-looking H. That symbol in Luwian logogram is a symbol for portal or gate, which is also associated with the Deus logogram. Another symbol that you see on the stones is and I just say this in reference, is an English-looking eye. This eye logogram in Luwian means temple or house. So we see some of these logograms that are established already and have been vetted. Interestingly enough, in 1943, at another site called Kara Tepe, not to be confused with Karahan Tepe, but at Kara Tepe, they found Luwian logograms on those stones, which is also dated to the Neolithic. So it's not an isolated find. But no one has formally come out at Gobekli Tepe and said these are Luwian logograms. Why is that? There's just a handful of expert scholars in the world, and I'm just talking few who knows the Luwian logogram language. There's not very many of these scholars. Luwian was predominantly used between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. So this is way outside the scope of the Neolithic. But why would you have writing that dates back to the Bronze Age and the Luwians in the Neolithic? So there's a big problem here on the timeline. If that is confirmed as Luwian logograms. Now, there is another language very similar to Luwian that uses logograms, and I'm not that quite familiar with it. So there's another candidate for a language out there, but
could it be a prototype of Luwian, like Phoenician was of Hebrew or something?
I don't think so, because we don't have that. We don't have those prototype Luwian going back that early, which means that the only conclusion is, well, there's two. Is one. It's another language similar to Luwian that used logograms, and that would need to be investigated further by other scholars. Two is that that's not in the Neolithic. If it's Luwian, you have to push that forward in time to the Bronze Age.
So obviously, which perspective do you take? That the timeline altering, or it could be a different language than Luwian?
No, I'm going with the Luwian in the book.
Okay. That's what I thought.
Specifically points out Luwian because that's the symbols that we know of. And the 1943 find in Kara Tepe was identified as Luwian. So look, this is all a theory, and it's based on circumstantial evidence, but there is some evidence pointing to Luwian logograms, which is also known as Anatolian hieroglyphics. It was discovered in the 1800s, but it was misidentified as hieroglyphic Hittite. Then it was later on that scholars realized that it's not hieroglyphic Hittite, but it's Luwian logograms. So that would conventionally redate and culturally redate Gobekli Tepe, not to the Neolithic, but back to the much forward in time to the Bronze Age. It looks Neolithic, and I understand this is why they date it there. Why? Because they're stone vessels. There's no pottery, and in the conventional view, there's no writing. So this puts it in the Stone Age. But what I'm suggesting is if it's Luwian logogram language on the stone, which is Anatolian hieroglyphics, then the reason we don't see pottery or any of these other things is because they're using the natural resources around them, and they have a bunch of stone. This is why everything's out of stone. It's not to say that, somewhere, else in Mesopotamia, they're not already using pottery because they have access to, the clay that they can make pottery. So I think they're using the natural resources around them, which is stone, and perhaps that that implies that, why archaeologists put it in the Stone Age. But if, again, going back to the logograms, if this language is identified as Luwian, then you can't push Luwian that far back to the Neolithic. You would have to redate it culturally, probably as early as the Bronze Age, which would be a massive change in the timeline. You would have to completely redate not only Gobekli Tepe, but other sites in the region that were considered Neolithic. You would have to also re-examine all those sites, potentially, like Kara Tepe, back to the the Bronze Age. So it's an important detail that I think perhaps signals a more impactful understanding of these sites. And so I'm proposing a couple of new theories in the book, but one of them is that the iconography on the stones is Luwian logogram language.
It seems like to me, I mean, I'm a novice at this, obviously, but just seems like to me it would totally question everything, which needs to be. I've noticed that in archaeology is that recently they're totally re-questioning a lot of preconceived presuppositions that we've had. And I was thinking when you were saying that there could be some overlap. I mean, we as humans tend to think so linear. Like you have the Stone Age, and then I don't know all the different ones, but then the Bronze, and that they're so neatly compartmentalized. In reality, is it's more like a Venn kind of diagram, and it could have just been like you said. We still use stone today.
Right.
5,000 years from now, which I don't think we'll be here, but 5,000 years from now, I think Jesus will come back. But 5,000 years from now, they could look back and say, are they Stone Age too? Because they had stone. I think that what you're talking about with the Luwian, I think that's the key to the dating more than just the materials that they made. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, well, yeah, certainly. I mean, that's why I'm proposing it in the book
Yeah.
is a key theory. But look, even today, if you compare cultures today, we're in the 21st century in the West, and there's a new space age happening now. We have organizations like SpaceX that are sending up, private spacecraft into space. We have a lot of technology, things that just we take for granted every day, like computers and chips and cars and communications and things like this. But yet there's tribes in the Amazon who are living what we would think of a primitive lifestyle.
Yeah.
And they're still living with a kind of a hunter-gatherer type of lifestyle, but they live in grass huts, and they have bows and arrows, and they have spears and things like this. And some of these cultures have been recently contacted for the first time, and but yet they live contemporaneous with us in the world in the 21st century. But if you look at that, if you zero in on that culture specifically, you would think that they perhaps were not a 21st century culture. You would think that they were older. Why? Because there's no technology associated with that particular culture. So just because a culture is culturally locked doesn't mean that there's not advancements and other progressions going on around the world. And I think that's what's happened with Gobekli Tepe. They're kind of locked into the stone vessel use because of the natural resources around them. But at the same time, if this is Bronze Age, there's other cultures in Mesopotamia that already have pottery and writing and this explosion of civilization that we see in the Sumerian culture. There's no record before any of that. And then all of a sudden you have an explosion of civilization with writing and art and ceramics, all these things that just suddenly come on the scene with no evidence of evolution happening at all. And I'm talking a cultural evolution. It's just a sudden onset of civilization appears on the scene after some event that has happened, and then all of a sudden you have a record of stasis to a record of this explosion of civilization that suddenly occurs out of the blue. And this is part of the reason why I'm digging into Gobekli Tepe is because personally for me, after some of my simple assumptions were easily dismissed, then I began to search just for an understanding for myself. What is this site? Why would these people live here? Initially, archaeologists thought they came to the site and then they left. Now we understand they made homes there. They lived there at the site. It was continually probably inhabited there between 1,000 and 1,500 years of use.
Right.
So my purpose was to figure out who were the people that lived there? Why were they at the site other than food and natural resources? What does the religious implications imply?
Mm.
And how does that tie back to anything post-flood, post-Tower of Babel? What were the people doing in that area at that time? And then what were they doing in these enclosures, which I considered sacred space? What were they
Right.
doing in these enclosures? And this is the whole reason for just digging in the research. And 5 years, it took 5 years of research to get this out, because there was no central source of getting any of this information out, in one place.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of just fact finding little nuggets of information here, there, and it took a long time to try to piece this all together. Finally, in one book, in one volume, we now have all this information pieced together, and some of these new theories that I'm putting forth in the book.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, I'm just sitting here. My brain is going 90 nothing. Thinking about, and like I said, I'm a newbie. I'm a novice at this, but I was just sitting here thinking about. We obviously could have the narrative wrong. What if the very fact that they are where they are, Aaron, is because of the stone, and that stone aspect played into their religion, and that's why there's where am I making sense? I don't. I'm
I think,
thinking this, but I don't know if it's coming out. I think you kind of went into that in your book, right?
well, I think it's the opposite.
Okay.
Yeah, so let me just try to put it a little bit more succinctly. They were there. Now remember, the people of the Neolithic were known as people of the bull.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just assume this was a Neolithic site as conventionally dated. Well, they're there first and foremost is because of the natural resources along the plains of Haran. You have wild wheat. You have two forms of wild wheat, einkorn and einhorn wheat, and then you have barley. You have all the game that we see evidence of hunting there. You got water. Why wouldn't you make a home there when you have all the natural resources around you to live?
Yeah.
So I think that's why they lived there. The stones didn't bring them there. The food source brought them there.
Okay.
So okay, so now they have a natural resource that they can go and harvest the grains. They can hunt. They can live. This is a fertile place. Why would you? These are green pastures. Why would you? Why would you leave? So
Exactly.
the people made a home there, but in their cosmology, in their belief systems, they believed that nature connected back to the divine. Everything around them was considered part of the divine world. So the earth, the stars, the sun, the moon, the water, the wind, fire, cosmological events that happen in the such as solar eclipses, things like this, life and death, the germination of the wheat from it coming up in the spring to the harvest to the winter when everything dies back. This is all, they regard all this as part of their cosmology. And so when they see all this in nature, they believe that there's certain aspects of what impacts them on an everyday scale is impactful in eternity in the afterlife. So things that are happening are in real-time events that are connected with the supernatural, but also in eternity, because they did believe they had a very connected belief system in the afterlife.
Yeah, Aaron, could you go into the whole notion of ancestor worship, worship of the deified dead, and how that connects to the archaeology here?
Yeah, sure. So the food brought them to there. The religious ideology is the thing that actually coalesced them together in their community, because now they have several things now that are happening at the site that implies religious ideology. Okay, so we talked about the symbols on the stone, the iconography on the stones. So we have the animals, which probably represents guardian animal spirits. Then we have the two anthropomorphic pillars that are 18 and a half foot tall in enclosure D. But you also have smaller T stones
Right.
there at the site. And so because of this religious ideology, they form these sacred spaces, which are the enclosures at Gobekli Tepe. They're sacred because they are lined with plaster. They plastered the floors and the walls. We found evidence of plaster at Gobekli Tepe. So we know that in a communal or a ritual setting, these spaces were considered sacred. They were not for everyday use, so that the floors were plastered, probably a white plaster, and there was, like in enclosure D, there was a processional way into the enclosure. Then you had bench seating around the sides that encircle these two central anthropomorphic images. Now, remember, these were probably roofed and not open to the sky like they are today. And so when you went in there, it was dark. Well, when you took torches in there, that would create aspects of shadows from these stones that were cast on the floor and on the walls, and those were symbolized as spirits. Those were the living spirits of these stones. And so because they had such a connection to the afterlife and to everything in nature, so when it rained, they attributed that to a deity. When there was probably some kind of an eclipse, they attributed that to a deity. When they saw the full moon in the sky, that was a deity. When they saw the big auric bulls roaming the Haran plain down there, that was a deity. They had deified things in heaven and earth. But the other thing that they had deified were the two anthropomorphic images in enclosure D. And this is why we have the iconography of the image of the bull cranium on Western Pillar 31, and on Eastern Pillar 18, which is next to it, we see the iconography of a crescent moon, of a disc above that, and above that is this H-looking symbol. But when you look into that H a little bit closer, it looks like two people holding hands, standing side by side in profile. Again, this is that H logogram. If that is the case, this is a connection between humans. But in the greater sense, it's a connection of the axis mundi between heaven and earth. Okay, so this is a connection between the physical realm and the spiritual realm. And with that crescent moon and that full disk on Eastern Pillar 18, that is considered a crescent star. It's a crescent moon with either a full moon or probably a sun. We see later on in Akkadian symbols, this was identified as a sun, and this was known as a crescent star. The crescent star actually is considered a divinity symbol that represents fertility. And when you look at the connection between the crescent star on Eastern Pillar 18 and the iconography of the bull cranium on Western Pillar 31, now you have identified those two pillars as the deification of Adam as the bull god An in the Sumerian pantheon, who they have deified their ancestor father in the Sumerian pantheon as the bull god An. And they have deified Eve as the crescent star image on Eastern Pillar 18. They have deified their two original ancestors as gods.
And she would also kind of eventually lead into the whole notion of the Great Mother, kind of.
This would be considered sacred mother goddess worship.
Yeah.
And this goes back to the deification of their very first ancestors, Adam and Eve. This is why you have the bull cranium image and the crescent star image on both. Now, they're not identified in the sexes, perhaps, on the stones, but the two symbols identify them. Also, you see that the arms, there's long arms, and they wrap around to the navel in the front. These arms, in archaeology and Ugaritic literature, we see that arms signal deity status, specifically in Baal worship. And so these arms represent not only physical arms of these people, but it also signals deity status. They have deified these two figures. Also, what's interesting in the very front is that they're wearing belts with fox pelt loincloths covering the front.
Skins, yeah.
Why would you need two stones depicted with two people covering their nakedness with fox pelt loincloths? This goes specifically back to the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis.
Yeah.
This is the only I think one of the only explanations that you can come to is that they have deified their original ancestors who are covering their nakedness by these fox pelt loincloths, who are signaling deity status. That's also perhaps why they're so tall, so large, at 18 and a half foot tall. And so they go into this sacred space, perhaps in a ritual or some kind of, some kind of an event that was sacred to them. And I think it was perhaps when a person died in the community that they believed that soul went back to the netherworld to die in the netherworld, but to get reborn as a god back to the heavens, you had to go back through the stones through your ancestors who gave you eternal life, and that was deified Adam and deified Eve, but specifically Eve, because Eve could give birth to the next generation. So when she gave birth to another son, that was considered a reincarnation of the father, and so on and so forth. So it's this regeneration connection that you had to ensure that your loved one was transformed from death in the netherworld back to the heavens, but you had to do it through your sacred ancestors. And this is exactly why we see these two anthropomorphic pillars in enclosure D. This is perhaps part of veneration, ancestor worship, specifically to those two, but to the other stones as well, with the guardian spirits of the animals represented. This is to ensure that their loved ones would continue on in a prosperous and peaceful afterlife.
Maybe I'm just way out there, but it almost sounds like a meeting of the council. You have a human aspect there, and I know that there's no indication of Yahweh or anything like that, but
No.
it's like a perverted form of the divine council. You come before, with the creature beings, and then the two gods, which would be Adam and Eve, that they've deified.
Well, and this is exactly, I think, on the right trajectory here, because look, they found skull fragments at Gobekli Tepe in these enclosures. Now, also, they have found 3 full human burials under the floors of the homes at Gobekli Tepe. 2 were found in close proximity. 1 was found on the other side of the complex. But this is exactly what we would see in other regional sites like Çatalhöyük, who also buried their dead under the floor.
Interesting.
But in the enclosures, there was only skull fragments. So here's the idea, is that when your ancestor died, you don't take your whole ancestor into the enclosures. This is why there was drill holes found in the skulls. I think probably what they did was they took the skulls of the ancestors and they took them into the enclosures and they suspended them with those drill holes. And they did some kind of libation or ritual ceremony, religious in nature, that would ensure your loved one went back to the stars where they believed that these gods lived. They believed that Adam was deified as the bull god, An, which is in the Sumerian pantheon, foremost of the Sumerian gods. He was a sky god who ruled over everything. And in Sumerian, when you break down that word An, A-N, in Sumerian, the A means ancestor or father. The N means to lift up on high, or to lift up on the highest, or place in the highest. So this is why we have the name An. It's the god who rules supreme in the sky, who is over everything. And they have deified Adam in the image of the bull as that god. And then they have deified Eve with the crescent star in fertility. So fertility is a very big part of the imagery at Gobekli Tepe, and also at Karahan Tepe and others. You see phallic images all over. And the phallic images, interestingly enough, some of these phallic images are from headless people. So they're dead, but they have these phallic images. And this goes back to the fertility symbols.
Okay, figure 9 at Çatalhöyük has the headless people, the painting on the wall there. I'm just getting this straight from the book here. But it also has vultures, or what looks to me like vultures. So the vultures, maybe some sort of sky burial, will come into that somehow?
We don't know for sure. There's a theory that they perhaps perform sky burials, but I don't think that's the case when you have human, people buried under the floors of the houses. That would not indicate a sky burial. And they've found 3 of those at Gobekli Tepe already. This was a known burial practice at Çatalhöyük, where they buried your ancestor under the floor of your house. Why? Because probably, at least we know later on, as an archaeological marker in about 2000 BC, there was a monthly ritual called the Kipsum, where they would take your ancestor out of the floor and you would feed them symbolically with water and bread. And then, you spend a little time with them and then put them back in the floor. This is to keep them alive in the afterlife. This is why they would do that with the water and the bread. It was a symbological ritual that they performed. I'm not saying they did that at Gobekli Tepe, but I'm saying that there's a good case for them doing that. So I don't think it would imply a sky burial there.
Yeah, you're right. I just thought about the vultures.
Well, the vultures goes back to the regeneration theory, and vulture is symbolically tied back to Eve and the regeneration of that person who has died to regenerate their spirit as a god, as a star god, back to the heavens.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of detail there. I walk you through that in the book so you have an understanding of the symbology of the vulture and this ethiophalic imagery found at Gobekli Tepe, because it all relates back to a regeneration process of a person who has died. And the only way they believe in their cosmological view that they can attain eternal life is to go back through their ancestors who they have now deified. And this is where we get into the religious iconography and symbology of Gobekli Tepe and how it ties back to the deification of the moon and the deification of the bull as well.
So it's almost like they had to be born again, but it's just not the way we see it today.
Well,
It's similar. Yeah.
They've totally lost the connection with God in the garden. Mankind physically, there's two deaths. There's a physical death, and then there's an immediate spiritual death that happens. Their connection and their relationship to God has been cut off in the garden, and now everything has changed. Now we have, Adam and Eve live, but they eventually physically die. And so we have the flood, and then we have the first type of Antichrist, shadow of the Antichrist that comes on the scene, which is in the form of Nimrod. And Nimrod does something that God doesn't, he doesn't allow. Matter of fact, he tells them directions and some things to do. One is to disperse and to multiply, and they do exactly the opposite when Nimrod shows on the scene. They congregate, they do three things. They build a city, they build a tower, and then they want to build a name. And so this is a direct kind of disobedience to what the Lord has already told them to do, was to not congregate, but was to scatter. So now they're doing these three things at the Tower of Babel, and Nimrod now wants to get back at the Lord for wiping out all of his ancestors in the flood, except for Noah and his family. So now he's going to get even, but this is in direct disobedience. Again, this is why we see Elohim as one of the few cases in the Old Testament where Elohim directly intervenes into the affairs of mankind directly and stops that process from happening by confusing the tongues at Babel. And so now when you do that, hey, hand me a brick. What did you say? Hand me a brick. Well, I don't understand what what are you saying? Now there's a confusion. Now you can't organize and finish this thing out. It wasn't that God was worried about them finishing the tower up to the thing. It was a spiritual purpose behind it. And Derek Gilbert, who wrote some wonderful books, Veneration, I cite in our book. A number of other books, but he talks about where Babel was originally located, that pre-flood there was a temple dedicated to Enki there, and that he thought the reason, if I'm remembering this right, they wanted to build that tower there, it was over the prior temple to Enki, which was a gateway to the netherworld. And who knows what that would have released out of there had they been able to complete it and do everything.
Right. Yeah.
A spiritual gateway, perhaps. So this is why the Lord comes down and completely stops that process. And now we see the tongues get, confused, people get scattered. And it's after this, probably hundreds of years later, that you find Gobekli Tepe on the biblical timeline. Now, in the back of the book, I put in two chronology timetables for Gobekli Tepe. One is based on the Masoretic text timeline. One is based on the Septuagint timeline. But it doesn't really matter which one you use. They're within close proximity to each
Yeah, I was
other
gonna say they're pretty close,
on the date.
relatively.
So this is exactly where you find Gobekli Tepe. It's not Neolithic, I don't think. I think biblically you have to also redate this, not just from the language we already talked about, but just from a biblical revision. And this is exactly why I get into all the areas in the book that we did, so we can walk you through the process of how we get there. But this is some really important observations and some smaller details that perhaps get overlooked at other places have now finally been converged into one single volume in this book, and it's taken us 5 years to do it.
No, yeah, it's great. If all the things you're talking about, which I believe are true, uh, are all in one place now, yeah, it's like you can go forward to it, and other people can build on your work too. Which that leads to my question that I wanted to kind of wrap this up with is, so what's next for you with your research of Göbekli Tepe? What I know you have some plans, I'm sure, ideas or some different areas you want to go in more depth. What would that be? What
Well,
would
I
that look
I
like?
don't really have any plans to do any other work. I mean, this is 5, almost 6 years
Okay.
of my life getting this worked
Yeah.
out now that's now available.
Yeah.
So my head's been in this space for a long time, and I don't really have any plans to dig in anymore unless I find a reason to.
Mm-hmm.
If there's some areas that I would probably like to do some more work in, that would be in the Luwian logogram linguistic connection that I believe is there, but only further excavations will reveal this if it is deemed true. And right now they have slowed the process of excavation at Gobekli Tepe. At the current pace they were at, it was going to take over 100 years for them to fully excavate this 20-acre site. Now that they're slowing down the pace, we don't even, and information is so slow coming out of there, we don't even know if this is going to be a possibility or not. So perhaps at other neighboring sites, they would help find more clues. But I would like to perhaps at least dig into that, or my hope is to have Luwian linguistic scholars look into this possibility of language there at Gobekli Tepe. Secondly, I would like to look into the a little bit more in detail about the religious iconography at the site. If
Mm-hmm.
that bears out with
Yeah.
more crescent star symbols indicative of lunar moon worship there. We know at the site in Haran, which is where biblical Edessa was located, is modern day Shanlurfa. This is exactly where we find Abram, who lived there with his father Terah, worship the moon god. Moon
Yeah.
god worship was already prevalent in this area. In archaeological records, we find often two men flanking a crescent moon standard. We see at Jericho, they were worshiping the moon god, which is perhaps at the same time as Gobekli Tepe. Moon god worship was prevalent there. We see that in cultures that they've named the moon god Sin, which is spelt Sin, but pronounced seen as you have seen something, Seen, but it's pronounced
Right.
seen. But the moon god is seen there, which is a very prevalent moon god in this region. And I think perhaps that some more information with the lunar worship, with the bull worship, with the Luwian linguistic connection, I think these are all areas that I would pursue if more evidence came out of the area, in particularly at Gobekli Tepe. But that may be more difficult now with the slowing of these excavations. So until then, we're going to have to wait and see. Only about 10% of Gobekli Tepe has been excavated. So we're going to
Wow.
have to really
Only ten
wait and
percent.
see
Wow.
what more comes to light if it does.
Tip
Now,
of the iceberg.
well, let me ask you this, Aaron, and I'm stirring it up again. But the biblical, there's the wilderness of Sin. Is that related to what you're talking
Yeah,
about?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, that all
Yeah.
goes back to the moon god, the
Okay.
wilderness of the
Okay.
moon god. That's how you would
Yeah.
say that. They wandered in the wilderness of Sin.
Yeah. Okay.
And that
Wow, I never thought of that.
there's a whole nother gold nugget right there for you to dig into, perhaps with someone else on another show. But look, when they're wandering in the wilderness of Sin for 40
Yeah.
years,
Yeah.
because they disobeyed God,
Yeah. There's something there.
there's something
Yeah.
there. There's something there
Yeah.
to that.
Yeah. I've really learned. I had a friend who, when he mentored me, said, "Look, you need to go back and look at the names of the places and the The biblical writers are telling you stuff with the names of the places that you need to transliterate them into some kind of English where you can understand, and that's a kind of an example of what you're talking about. And there's a significance, of them wandering in the wilderness of sin, which
Yeah.
for years I pronounced sin. So because
Yeah,
that's
because
simply
in our English vocabulary, we
yeah,
pronounce it as sin because it's spelt that way.
right, right.
That's not how it's pronounced during that time, but that's exactly what that identifies as is the moon god there. So
Yeah.
this is why we see the crescent standard of the moon god and the crescent star on Eastern Pillar 18. This goes back to the worship of the moon and the sun and the divine symbol, the fertility symbol of Eve. They have deified Eve. So again, this all gets back to the regeneration theory about why they have to go back to the stones
Mhm.
and do this type of these rituals, perhaps for their either one, it's ancestor worship, or two, it's to ensure that their loved ones made it through this this spiritual renewal or rebirth to attain eternal life. But look, they're not doing it through they're not doing it through God and what God has said to do. They have now deified several things in nature, like the moon and the bull, and they have deified their original ancestors. Later on, we see Nimrod gets deified after death. We see that
Yeah.
Noah gets deified. The Egyptian pharaohs claim that they all came from Noah. All the pharaohs came from Noah.
Ooh.
We see other people later on deified after death. But what's interesting, when you get to Egypt, those pharaohs are not deified after death. They are deified when they become pharaoh. They are living embodiments of a deity.
Interesting.
And so this is why you have the connection of the sun god Ra. I get into a little bit of that in the book with comparison, cultural comparison with Egypt in the vulture and the sun god and what all this means, because a lot of the symbols that carry forward in times such as Egypt have the same meaning. And so we can probably perhaps imply the symbology on the stones at Gobekli Tepe. Symbols usually carry the same meaning throughout cultures.
Well, and something else interesting, it just popped up in my brain that I think could be a part of this is the fact, and I just talked about this earlier. Jacob laying his head on a stone to divinate. It was like he was trying to talk to his ancestors to figure out what to do, and it ended up that Yahweh, despite his occultic thing, still spoke to him through a dream. That goes along with the general tenor of what you're saying. Even stones were avenues for them to communicate with the ancestors and stuff, and that could have been very well what the whole Gobekli Tepe thing was about.
Yeah, well, that's why
I
we
guess.
see these two anthropomorphic images in Enclosure 18. You know, they have embodied their ancestors in stone in these anthropomorphic images. If you go back to Jeremiah, it says the people say that we, to a stone, we came from you, from a piece of wood, you're our ancestor. I'm just
Yeah.
paraphrasing that. You can go back to Jeremiah and look it up. That this is exactly what it's talking about. Don't go to a stone or to a piece of wood that's carved and claim that it's your ancestor, because it's not. This is why God exactly prohibited the Israelites from cutting stone when they made an
Yeah.
altar, because
Rough you. Yep.
or graven images, because this is exactly what the Egyptians did with their gods. They deified their gods in stone. And so God says, don't carve graven images out of stone, because I'm not an image that can be carved into stone. So don't do that.
Jesus took it even a step further. He said, "Even the stones will cry out if you don't worship me." Now that's
Yeah.
it's got to have some kind of cultural context to what we're talking about.
Yeah,
No,
yeah,
the
could
false
be. I mean,
gods
there's
will cry out. Yeah.
yeah. Well, maybe there's another nugget there for you.
Ah, man, you're like opening all kinds of avenues here.
Yeah.
Wow. Look, Aaron, I appreciate so much for you coming on
Yeah.
our show, and we've enjoyed it. If people want to find out more about it, of course, we're going to post the book on our on the show notes and stuff. Is there any other ways they can follow you? What are your details, your deets?
Yeah, just go. The book's on Amazon. It's now available in Kindle. We had not planned to do
Cool.
that, but we changed our mind and decided to put it on Kindle. So it was the number one new release on Amazon in archaeology, the number one new release in prehistory, and the number one new release in ancient knowledge. when
Yeah,
it
it
when it
deserves it.
first came out.
Yeah.
If you want to follow my work, I have a lot of articles and things that I put up on Substack. You
It's
can
good.
join as a free member, or if you want exclusive member content, you can for a cup of coffee a month, you can join up as a member to the Substack. So it's aaronjudkins.substack.com.
And you cover so many good topics, but the one you did about the Shroud of Turin, I mean, that's why I reached out to you. But yeah, I
Yeah,
love your Substack. It's cool. So
yeah. Thanks. I just try to, I'll send out an email or two a week on various topics. I did one on the archaeological evidence of Jesus and the resurrection.
yeah, that was good
I
too.
did one on theological symbology in the movie Star Wars and Christian theology.
I haven't seen that one yet. I have to check it.
And then I've got some current ones on dinosaurs and things like that. But yeah, you can
Wow.
find a lot of things there for you, a lot of free content there. And then over at Patreon, if you
Mm-hmm.
go to Ancient Pathways on Patreon, you can find a lot of free content there. But again, if you want to become a member for a cup of coffee a month, you can get some really cool information that I have amassed only at this one particular place on Patreon. It's called Ancient Pathways.
Okay.
I've got digital volume libraries there. So I've got the Book of Giants, volumes 1, 2, and 3. It's everything related to giants and literature and ancient literature. And it's all
Wow.
available
That's wow.
at your download. It's just a massive amount of information that I've collected over the course of my life in various subjects. So a lot of digital library things that you can download. These are hard to find text and documents that's very difficult to source. I've got the complete Dead Sea Scrolls in English at your download in English. I've got the
Wow.
complete
That's awesome.
Septuagint Bible, or the Septuagint in English there. I have another one called Ancient Historical Documents. It's various documents. I think there's 20 or 25 documents in each volume. There's video content. There's other things that I have done that I've put up there. There's other interviews that I've done. So there's a lot of information there for you.
And
PDF
this is
book
only this is only Patreon, right? The
on the
Ancient Pathways
Patreon.
Patreon. Okay. All right.
Yeah, so
Cool.
everything's there. It's you can find my work there. I don't really have any plans to, like I said, to do any more research right now on the Gobekli Tepe until further research comes to light. Uh,
All right.
um, you know,
Which might not happen even in our lifetimes. It
well,
sounds
yeah, I
like.
mean,
Yeah.
hopefully we'll find more information, but my hope is that some of my theories here, and again, they're theories. I'm not dogmatic
Right. Right.
about these, but I'm just
Right.
saying they're theories. But I'm hoping that in the archaeological record and in scholarship, my theories will be confirmed. And if
Yeah.
that's the case, that are the implications in our understanding about this site at Gobekli Tepe will be completely revolutionized, and to what we thought we knew would have to be changed in the archaeological record. And I think this site is game changing for that.
I do too.
Mhm.
And this is why we're proposing these new theories in the book. So again, we do look at biblical connections. We do look at the Watcher implications with Dr. Judd Burton's chapter in the book, which is
Mm-hmm.
really well done. But in the academics of it all, if you don't like the biblical worldview, or if you don't like the biblical connections, if you just simply look at it with the new theories that we're proposing, even though they have biblical ties, I think it's worth investigating that, and that's what I'm hoping that academia will bear out in scholarship, is that these theories that will bear some light again, specifically referencing back to the Luwian logogram theory and the linguistic connections there. I'm very hopeful that will shed some new light on our understanding at Gobekli Tepe.
Yeah, I always heard people talk about it. I've heard Dr. Judd or Doug Judd talk about it. I've heard different people, and I was like, what is this Gobekli Tepe? And then your book came out, and so now I have I really see the importance of it.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brandon. Thanks, Lindsay, for having me on your show.
Thanks for listening and supporting us. And remember, stay naturally supernatural.